Before you clear out that tired summer garden, look at those empty spaces one more time. If you garden in the south, September may not be the end of your growing season at all. It may be the beginning of one of your best opportunities to grow food. Tomatoes may be slowing down, cucumber vines may look worn out, and a few containers may be sitting empty after weeks of heat. But cooler season crops can turn that same space into a productive fall garden. The key is not to treat September like a switch that instantly turns summer into fall. In many southern gardens, the calendar says autumn, while the soil, patio, and afternoon air still behave like summer. That matters because some crops benefit from getting started as early as local conditions allow, while others can struggle if you rush them into excessive heat. So in this video, we are not simply going to name 15 vegetables and tell you to plant them all on the same day. We are going to decide what deserves space first, what is better direct sown, what is easier to establish from transplants, what works well in containers, and what may be smarter to delay until temperatures ease. And stay with me, because near the end I will narrow all 15 crops down to 5 priorities for a gardener with limited space. That final 5 is not a universal ranking for every yard in the south. It is a practical starting point based on how useful each crop can be, how efficiently it uses space, and how well it fits the transition from late summer heat into fall. If your September is still extremely hot, you may shift the order. If your first frost tends to arrive earlier, you may shift it again. The point is to make decisions, not blindly follow a calendar. Start with a garden you actually have. A southern backyard with 1 raised bed may need a completely different plan from a Gulf Coast patio with 5 containers. A gardener in the upper south may be thinking about the first frost sooner than someone farther south. Even within one state, planting windows can move by weeks. So instead of pretending there is one perfect September date, use 4 questions. Is my garden still running hot? Should this crop be direct sown or transplanted? Does it deserve permanent bed space, or can it earn its keep in a container? And is it a fast crop, a repeat harvest crop, or a longer fall investment? That last question is especially important. High yield does not always mean one enormous harvest. With leafy vegetables, yield can come from repeated harvests of outer leaves. With radishes, value can come from quick turnover and the ability to use small gaps. With beets and turnips, you can use both the greens and the roots. With bunching onions, a narrow strip along the edge of a bed can become productive space. And with broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower, the value is different again because you are committing space for a longer period to grow a substantial cool season crop. Before we get to those 3 longer season crops, take a moment to inspect the garden itself. Pull out only the summer plants that are truly finished or badly declining. Do not clear healthy food-producing plants just because September arrived. Where you have open soil, remove weeds, loosen compacted areas without destroying the structure of the entire bed, and add finished compost if your soil needs organic matter. In containers, check drainage holes and make sure old potting mix has not collapsed into a dense, waterlogged mass. Fall crops appreciate consistent moisture, but roots still need air. Now check moisture before you sow anything. The top ½ inch of a raised bed can dry surprisingly fast in September sun, and containers can dry even faster. That becomes critical when you are dealing with small seeds. A carrot seed near the surface, a lettuce seed, or a newly emerged mustard seedling does not have a deep root system to reach moisture below. If that thin surface layer repeatedly dries out during germination, your stand can become patchy before you ever see the problem. At the same time, do not turn the seedbed into mud. The goal is evenly moist soil with enough air for roots and germinating seeds. A gentle watering method is better than blasting a shallow seed row with a hard stream that moves seeds, exposes roots, or crusts the surface. If afternoons are still brutally hot, temporary light shade during establishment can sometimes help young transplants and delicate seed beds. But the long-term goal is still to give these cool season vegetables the light they need once conditions moderate. This is where September gardening becomes more interesting than simply reading a seed packet. The calendar says fall, but your garden may still be behaving like summer. The first 3 crops make that difference obvious because they need more time than many of the greens and root crops we will cover later. Those 3 are broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower. Let us start with broccoli. If you have strong, healthy broccoli transplants available at the right time for your local area, September can be a valuable window for getting them established in many southern gardens. Broccoli is not a crop I would hide in the last corner of the bed and hope for the best. It deserves a position with good light, reasonable air movement, fertile soil, and enough room to develop without being smothered by neighboring plants. The advantage of a transplant is simple. You are not asking a tiny seed to handle every challenge of late summer heat in the open bed. You are starting with a plant that already has leaves and a functioning root system. That does not mean it is invincible. A transplant moved from a protected nursery environment into a hot raised bed can wilt quickly if the root ball dries out. Water it in carefully, keep the root zone consistently moist during establishment, and pay attention to afternoon stress during the hottest part of the transition. Do not bury broccoli deeper and deeper simply because the plant looks top-heavy. Set the transplant so the root system is well covered and the plant is stable. Then firm the soil gently around it. If your garden is windy, stability matters because repeated rocking can disturb new roots. And if you are growing in a container, remember that broccoli still needs real root volume. A tiny decorative pot may keep the plant alive for a while, but it does not give you the same margin for moisture, nutrients, and root development as a properly sized container. Broccoli is also a good example of why we need to define yield carefully. The first payoff is the main head, but many broccoli varieties can produce smaller side shoots after the main head is cut if the plant remains healthy. That repeated production is one reason broccoli can justify its space. Still, do not promise yourself endless harvests from one plant. Variety, temperature, plant health, and the length of your season all matter. Watch the leaves as the plant establishes. A little temporary wilting in hot afternoon conditions can happen, but persistent collapse, yellowing, or stalled growth tells you to investigate water, root condition, heat, or pest pressure. Do not respond to every stressed leaf by pouring on fertilizer. A newly planted broccoli seedling with dry roots needs moisture and recovery, not a stronger fertilizer solution. Broccoli rewards an early, sensible start, but the next crop makes an even stronger case for planning your bed before you fill every gap. That crop is cabbage. Cabbage is a long-term space commitment compared with radishes, leaf lettuce, or mustard greens. When you put a cabbage transplant into the center of a raised bed, imagine the mature plant, not the tiny seedling in your hand. Those small leaves will expand into a broad rosette before the head tightens. If you plant quick crops around it, give them a clear exit plan so they can be harvested before the cabbage needs that space. This is a perfect place to use succession and interplanting intelligently. You might place a short row of radishes in open soil near young cabbage, knowing the radishes will be removed while the cabbage is still expanding. What you do not want is a permanent wall of competing plants pressed against the cabbage for the whole season. The difference between efficient planting and overcrowding is whether the neighboring crop is gone before the larger crop needs the room. Like broccoli, cabbage benefits from even moisture. Alternating between bone-dry soil and a sudden soaking is not a good way to build steady growth. In containers, moisture swings can be more dramatic, so check the soil rather than watering only by habit. A container in full sun on a warm patio may need attention sooner than the same crop in a mulched raised bed. Cabbage can be grown in containers, but the container must fit the plant. This is not a crop to cram into a shallow bowl just because the seedling fits today. If patio space is limited, ask whether one cabbage plant deserves that container more than a repeat harvest green that can give you leaves over a longer period. There is no single correct answer. If your family loves fresh cabbage, it may absolutely deserve the space. If you want maximum repeated harvest from a tiny patio, other crops on this list may be more efficient. That is the kind of choice this video is designed to help you make. A high-yield garden is not the garden with the most plants. It is the garden where each plant has enough room to perform and where every part of the space has a job. And if cabbage asks for patience, cauliflower asks for precision. Cauliflower is often less forgiving than broccoli or cabbage when growing conditions swing sharply. A young plant that is repeatedly stressed by excessive heat, drought, root restriction, or poor establishment may never give you the result you expected. So if you are a beginner and your September afternoons are still intense, do not assume that simply planting cauliflower earlier is always better. A healthy transplant established at an appropriate local time is more valuable than a stressed plant forced into conditions it cannot handle well. Give cauliflower the same basic foundation: fertile, well-drained soil, steady moisture, room to develop, and a site with strong light once the worst heat has eased. If you use transplants, inspect them before planting. Look for compact, healthy growth rather than a weak, stretched plant that has been sitting too long in a small cell. Starting with a compromised transplant makes the rest of the season harder. Cauliflower is also a crop that teaches patience. You are dedicating meaningful space to a plant that will not reward you as quickly as a radish row. That is not a reason to avoid it. It is a reason to place it intentionally. If you only have one small raised bed, you may choose 1 or 2 cauliflower plants rather than filling half the bed with them. If you have a roomy garden and your family eats a lot of cauliflower, the calculation changes. The first 3 crops now give us our first major lesson. Broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower are longer fall investments. They deserve early planning, good transplant establishment, and enough room for their mature size. Once those plants are accounted for, we can shift to crops that give us much more flexibility. The next one is especially well suited to southern fall gardens: collards. Collards are valuable because they bridge conditions that make some other cool season greens nervous. They can handle a warmer transition period better than delicate spinach. And once cooler weather arrives, established plants can continue producing useful leaves. That combination makes collards a strong candidate for gardeners who want repeated harvest rather than one single head. The harvest strategy matters. Do not strip a young collard plant bare the moment it has a handful of leaves. Let it build a sturdy center and enough leaf area to keep growing. Then harvest older outer leaves while leaving the active center intact. This turns one plant into a continuing source of greens instead of a one-time harvest. Collards can work in raised beds, in-ground gardens, and sufficiently large containers. On a patio, one healthy collard plant can become a substantial plant, so give it room. In a bed, think about access. Put repeated harvest crops where you can reach them without stepping over carrots or crushing a row of seedlings every time you pick leaves. This is also a good moment to talk about pests. Fall can reduce pressure from some summer problems, but cool season vegetables are not pest-proof. Check the undersides of leaves. Look at the growing point. Small chewing damage is easier to manage when you notice it early than after a pest population has spread across every brassica in the bed. The goal is not to panic over one hole. The goal is regular observation. Keep collards in mind for our final 5 because they combine southern adaptability, repeated harvest, and good food value. But before we decide where they rank, compare them with another famous fall green, kale. Kale fits small gardens beautifully because the plant can stay productive while you harvest mature outer leaves. Like collards, it rewards a harvest style that protects the center. Take leaves from the outside, leave the growing point intact, and allow the plant to keep replacing what you remove. Kale can be started in more than one way, depending on your local conditions and how much time you have. Healthy transplants are convenient when you want to get established quickly. Direct sowing can work when temperatures and moisture are favorable. The important point is not to force one method everywhere. September in the south can range from comfortably mild to punishingly hot, and a method that succeeds in one garden may be frustrating a few hundred miles away. In containers, kale is one of the easier large leafy crops to justify because you can harvest it repeatedly. Again, do not crowd several full-size plants into a container designed for one root system. If you want more plants in a limited container, consider harvesting at a younger leaf stage rather than pretending multiple mature plants. can occupy the same root volume without competition. Kale and collards may seem similar, but they can play slightly different roles. Collards are a classic southern workhorse with broad leaves and strong warm-to-cool adaptability. Kale offers enormous variety in leaf shape, texture, and plant size, and many gardeners value it for repeated harvest. If you have room, grow both. If you do not, choose the one your household is more likely to eat. Productivity means nothing if the harvest stays in the refrigerator until it is compost. The next leafy crop gives us another kind of flexibility. Swiss chard can bridge warm and cool conditions while producing both colorful stems and useful leaves. It is not a root crop even though it is closely related to beets, so grow it for the foliage and stalks, not for an enlarged root. Swiss chard can be an excellent container crop because one plant can keep producing as you remove outer leaves. Give it consistent moisture and enough root room, especially if the container is exposed to afternoon sun. Leaves with large surface area lose water quickly, and a dry container can turn a productive plant into a wilted plant in a single hot afternoon. Harvest the same way you would manage many repeat harvest greens. Take mature outer leaves, protect the center, and avoid removing so much at once that the plant has no working leaf area left. If plants are crowded, thin them before they become a tangled mass. Those thinnings can sometimes be used as young greens, which means correcting spacing does not have to feel like waste. Now, notice what is happening in our fall garden. The first 3 crops required patience and permanent space. Collards, kale, and Swiss chard start giving us a different kind of yield. Leaves over time. The next crop adds speed to that equation. Mustard greens can move quickly, work in relatively small areas, and fit beautifully into succession planting. Instead of sowing every mustard seed you own in one afternoon, consider smaller sowings over time when local temperatures are suitable. That spreads the harvest and reduces the chance that every plant reaches the same stage at once. You can harvest mustard as young leaves or allow plants to grow larger, depending on how you like to use them. Mustard is also a good crop for showing how temperature changes flavor and texture. Warm conditions can push leafy greens towards stronger flavor and faster stress, while cooler weather often gives you more tender growth. That does not mean one warm day ruins the crop. It means timing and water matter. Direct sowing works well for mustard because the seed can go where the plant will grow. Prepare a fine surface, sow at an appropriate depth for the small seed, and keep that upper layer evenly moist until seedlings establish. Once they are up, thin crowded patches. A dense carpet may look productive in the first week, but plants still need air, light, and root space. We have reached the point where many gardeners become overconfident. Collards, kale, chard, and mustard can make September planting feel easy. Then they sow lettuce in a hot exposed bed. The surface dries repeatedly, and germination is disappointing. Lettuce is where the sentence we started with becomes critical again. The calendar says fall, but your garden may still be behaving like summer. Lettuce seed and young lettuce plants prefer cooler conditions than the peak heat of a southern summer. If your raised bed is still baking in intense afternoon sun, do not assume that sowing more seed will solve poor germination. First, manage the environment. Keep the seed zone consistently moist. Use gentle watering so the tiny seed is not displaced. If conditions are exceptionally hot, temporary shade during the hottest part of establishment can help, especially in containers and exposed seed beds. But do not create permanent, deep shade that leaves mature lettuce weak and stretched. The objective is to help the crop establish while heat is still lingering. Then give it the light it needs as conditions improve. In a patio garden, movable containers are useful because you can sometimes protect a newly seeded pot from brutal afternoon heat and later shift it into a brighter position. Leaf lettuce is especially useful in small spaces because you do not have to wait for one large head. Depending on the type, you can harvest outer leaves or cut young leaves while keeping the planting productive. This is another example of yield coming from repeated use rather than a single giant harvest. Succession sowing matters here too. If you sow all your lettuce at once, you may end up with more than you can eat during one short window. Smaller repeated sowings can give you a steadier supply. It also spreads risk. If one early sowing struggles in heat, the next sowing may emerge under better conditions. Pay attention to container temperature. A dark pot sitting on hot concrete can create a much warmer root zone than a raised bed surrounded by soil and mulch. If lettuce repeatedly wilts, even when the soil contains moisture, heat around the root zone may be part of the problem. You do not need a complicated sensor system to garden well. Touch the container, check the soil, watch the leaves, and compare morning condition with late afternoon condition. Your plants give you useful information, and if lettuce can struggle when September stays hot, spinach can be even less forgiving. Spinach is one crop I would never plant just because a title says, "Plant these in September." In some southern locations, September conditions may be good enough to start it. In hotter areas, waiting for cooler soil and air can give you a much better stand. This is exactly why local conditions beat a universal date. Spinach generally performs best as a cool season crop. Heat can reduce germination success and encourage plants to rush toward flowering once they are growing. So the smart move is not necessarily to be the first person in your neighborhood to sow spinach. The smart move is to sow it when your conditions are moving into the range where spinach can establish reliably. When you do so, keep the seedbed evenly moist but well drained. Do not plant into compacted, waterlogged soil and then compensate by watering more. Good soil structure matters. In a container, make sure excess water can escape. In a raised bed, avoid the low pocket that stays soggy after every irrigation. Spinach can provide repeated leaf harvest when managed carefully, but do not overharvest tiny plants. Build enough leaf area first. Then remove usable outer leaves or harvest according to the growth stage you want while protecting the plant's ability to continue. At this point, the biggest mistake should be clear. It is not choosing the wrong fall vegetable. It is giving every fall vegetable the same September treatment. Broccoli may benefit from getting a strong transplant established early. Spinach may reward patience. Mustard can be direct sown. Cabbage needs long-term space. Lettuce may need help through lingering heat. The next group changes the decision again because we are moving underground. Carrots are the crop that should make you slow down and pay attention to the top layer of soil. Their seeds are small and they are usually best direct sown where the roots will develop. Transplanting ordinary carrots risks disturbing the developing root. So this is not a crop I would routinely start in a tray and move later. Prepare the seed bed carefully. Remove large clods and stones from the immediate root zone, especially if you want straight roots. The soil does not need to be powder. It needs to be loose enough for roots to penetrate and fine enough at the surface for small seeds to maintain contact with moist soil. After sowing, the challenge is consistency. Carrot seeds can take longer to emerge than radishes, so the surface has more time to dry between sowing and germination. That is why gardeners sometimes think the seed was bad, when the real problem was a seedbed that dried repeatedly. Use a gentle spray or watering wand and monitor the surface. In hot, windy conditions, you may need to check more than once a day during germination, especially in a shallow container. The goal is not constant saturation. It is preventing the seed zone from going completely dry. Once seedlings emerge, thinning matters. A beautiful thick green line of carrot seedlings can hide a future problem. If roots are packed too closely, they compete for space, and you may get many tiny carrots instead of fewer well-developed ones. Thin according to the variety and the harvest size you want. Do it carefully so you disturb the remaining seedlings as little as possible. Containers can work very well for carrots if you match the container to the carrot type. Short, round, or compact varieties need less depth than long storage carrots. Choose the crop to fit the container rather than forcing a long-rooted variety into a shallow box. And resist the temptation to keep pulling plants up to check the roots. Once you pull a carrot, the test is over. Carrots ask for patience. The next root crop gives you an extra payoff while you wait because the tops are edible too. Beets can produce useful greens and, if given enough spacing and time, swollen roots beneath them. Beet seeds are often sold as what looks like one seed, but can contain a cluster of embryos. So several seedlings may emerge close together. That is why thinning can be especially important. Do not assume you planted incorrectly just because multiple seedlings appear from one spot. Thin, crowded seedlings, so the remaining plants have room to develop. The greens you remove during thinning can sometimes be used when they are clean, healthy, and large enough to handle, which turns a maintenance task into a small harvest. Later, mature beet leaves can also be used, but avoid stripping the plant if your main goal is a good root. Leaves are the plant's energy system. Beets fit raised beds and containers well when the soil is loose and the container has sufficient depth. Keep moisture even. Severe drying, followed by heavy watering, can stress plants and reduce quality. Again, the answer is not constant wetness, it is consistency. Now we come to the speed crop of the root group, radishes. Radishes earn their place because they can use small openings. They can mature faster than many vegetables around them, and they are easy to direct sow. This makes them useful between slower plants when you understand the timing. Imagine young broccoli plants with open soil between them. A short row of radishes can occupy some of that space early, then leave before the broccoli expands. That is productive interplanting. But if you sow a permanent crop there that will still be competing when the broccoli reaches full size, you have created crowding rather than efficiency. Radishes also work in containers because the root system is relatively compact for many varieties. Keep moisture steady so roots develop evenly. Hot weather can push quality in the wrong direction, so if your September remains very warm, choose your sowing window carefully instead of forcing one planting after another into stressful conditions. Succession planting is excellent for radishes. Sow a modest amount, then another small batch later when conditions remain favorable. This gives you a rolling harvest rather than a pile of radishes on one day. And harvest them at the appropriate stage for the variety. Instead of leaving them in the soil indefinitely, a root crop is not automatically improving just because it is getting older. Radishes give us speed. The next crop gives us two useful harvest directions from essentially the same patch of ground. Turnips can be grown for their greens, their roots, or both, depending on variety and how you manage the planting. Direct sow turnips into prepared soil and thin them according to your goal. If you mainly want tender greens, spacing can be different from a planting intended to produce larger roots. If you want both, avoid repeatedly removing so much foliage that the root has no leaf area left to fuel growth. Turnip greens can become one of the fastest ways to put homegrown food on the table from a fall planting, while the roots add a second harvest later. That dual-purpose value is exactly what makes a crop efficient in a small garden. You are getting more than one usable part without pretending the plant is producing an impossible amount of food. Turnips can also work in containers, especially if the container provides adequate depth and drainage. As with beets and carrots, loose soil helps root development. Do not compact the mix by pressing it down hard after sowing. Settle it gently with water. At this stage, our bed contains large long-term crops, repeated harvest greens, temperature-sensitive greens, and root crops. It may look as if every useful inch has been claimed, but edges and narrow strips are still valuable. And that is where bunching onions come in. Bunching onions do not need the same broad footprint as a cabbage or collard plant. They can fit along bed edges, in narrow rows, or in containers where vertical leaves use space efficiently. That makes them excellent for patios and compact gardens. You can start them from seed when conditions are suitable, or use established starts depending on what is available and your local planting schedule. Keep the seedbed evenly moist during germination and do not bury tiny onion seed too deeply. Once established, bunching onions can be harvested gradually, which lets you use them as needed rather than clearing the entire planting at once. Think of them as a space-finishing crop. They do not need to steal the center of the bed from a cauliflower plant. Give them the narrow strip that would otherwise be wasted. A productive garden often comes from these small design decisions. And now we come to bok choy, a crop that can grow quickly enough to look easy, but can still punish bad timing. Bok choy prefers cool growing conditions, and excessive heat can encourage stress and premature bolting. In a mild southern fall, it can be one of the most satisfying compact vegetables to grow. In a scorching September, it may be smarter to wait or use a protected establishment strategy. Bok choy can be direct sown or transplanted. If you direct sow, thin seedlings so each plant has the space needed for the size you plan to harvest. If you want baby bok choy, you can use tighter spacing than you would for full-size heads, but do not confuse closer spacing with unlimited density. Plants still need light and airflow. Containers are excellent for bok choy because the crop is compact and relatively fast compared with cabbage. A wide container can hold several plants when spaced realistically. Just remember that patio containers dry quickly and can overheat, so moisture and placement matter. Succession planting works here as well. Rather than betting the entire bok choy harvest on one sowing, plant a smaller batch, then repeat when conditions remain favorable. If the first sowing encounters a hot spell, the next may perform better as fall settles in. Now, step back and look at what these 15 crops are actually doing. Broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower are longer fall investments. Collards, kale, Swiss chard, and mustard greens give us repeated leafy harvests. Lettuce, spinach, and bok choy can be highly productive, but demand more attention to lingering heat. Carrots, beets, radishes, and turnips turn open soil into underground food, while some also provide edible tops. Bunching onions fill narrow spaces that larger plants cannot use efficiently. This is why planting all 15 in equal amounts makes no sense for most home gardens. The goal is to combine roles. You want some crops that pay quickly, some that keep giving, and some that occupy space longer but reward patience later. Suppose you have one raised bed. Start by placing the crops that will remain longest and become largest. Broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower need their mature footprint reserved from the beginning. Do not let their small transplant size fool you. Put them where they can expand without blocking access to the rest of the bed. Next, use temporary openings for faster crops. Radishes can occupy a short-term gap. Lettuce or mustard may fit along an accessible edge if temperature and spacing are suitable. Bunching onions can use a narrow strip. Root crops, such as carrots, need a location where the soil will not be repeatedly disturbed by harvesting a neighboring crop. Then think about reach. Repeat harvest greens belong where you can pick leaves without stepping into the bed. If the raised bed is against a wall or fence, do not hide kale or collards behind a row you cannot cross. Garden design is not just about fitting plants on paper. It is about how your hands will actually water, inspect, thin, and harvest them. If you have only a patio, the strategy changes. Do not try to recreate a full backyard garden in miniature by forcing one of every crop into undersized pots. Choose plants that justify container space. Leafy greens, radishes, bunching onions, bok choy, lettuce, and Swiss chard can be excellent choices. Kale and collards can work well in larger containers. Broccoli can work too if the container is sized appropriately. But remember that one large plant may occupy a pot for a significant part of the season. On a patio, mobility becomes an advantage. You can sometimes move newly seeded containers away from punishing afternoon heat, rotate pots for more even light, or shelter delicate seedlings from a severe storm. But mobility is not a substitute for good growing conditions. Plants still need adequate light, drainage, root volume, and consistent care. Now let us answer the question I promised at the beginning. If I had room for only 5 of these crops in a typical southern fall garden, which 5 would I prioritize? My first choice would be collards. They fit the southern transition well, tolerate conditions that can challenge more delicate greens, and reward you with repeated leaf harvests. A healthy collard plant can stay useful for a long stretch of the cool season, and you can harvest it without removing the entire plant. My second choice would be kale. It gives you another repeat harvest green with strong container and raised bed potential. If your family prefers kale to collards, reverse these first 2. The most productive crop is the crop you actually eat. My third choice would be radishes. They earn the spot for speed, small space efficiency, and their ability to fit around slower crops when used carefully. They also teach succession planting better than almost any other vegetable on this list. My fourth choice would be carrots. They add a root crop to the garden. They use vertical soil space rather than broad above-ground space, and a well-managed carrot row can stay productive without interfering with nearby leafy crops. They are not the fastest crop here, but they give the garden diversity and a harvest you cannot replace with another leafy green. My fifth choice would be broccoli, with one important condition. Your local planting window needs to support it. Broccoli deserves a spot because it benefits from getting established early enough. It provides a substantial cool season harvest, and many varieties can continue with side shoots after the main head. But if you are in a very hot part of the deep south and September is still too stressful for reliable establishment, I would not force broccoli into the ground just to follow this ranking. I would move another suitable green or root crop into that fifth position and start broccoli when local guidance and weather make more sense. And notice what is not in this final five. Spinach is not there, not because spinach is a poor crop, but because a September priority list for the entire south has to respect heat. In a cooler southern location, spinach may move way up. Cauliflower is not there because it demands more consistency and space than many beginners want to give it. Cabbage is not there because one plant occupies space for a long time, though it may absolutely belong in your garden if cabbage is a household favorite. The list is a decision tool, not a command. Your own final five should change with your kitchen, your climate, and your space. If your family eats bok choy every week, that crop may be more valuable than carrots. If you have a large in-ground garden, cabbage and cauliflower become easier to justify. If you only have containers, Swiss chard and bunching onions may beat broccoli for efficiency. Personal preference is not a minor detail. It is part of yield because food only has value when it is actually used. There is one more rule that matters as much as crop choice. Do not plant the whole fall garden in one burst of enthusiasm and then stop paying attention. September weather can swing. A week of unexpected heat can dry seedbeds. A heavy storm can compact exposed soil. Pests can find a new row of tender seedlings. Check the garden often enough to notice changes while they are still small. Water, according to the soil, the weather, and the plant stage. A newly germinating carrot row needs attention near the surface. An established collard plant has a deeper root system. A container may dry faster than an in-ground bed. Treating all three the same makes no sense. Feed the soil, but do not assume more fertilizer means more harvest. Start with fertile soil and finished compost where appropriate. Then use fertilizer according to crop needs and local soil conditions. Excess nitrogen can create lush growth without solving every problem, and over-fertilizing can damage roots or waste nutrients. If you garden in the same ground year after year, a soil test from your local extension service can be far more useful than guessing. Keep mulch light around tiny seedlings so you do not bury them, and use it more effectively once plants are established to moderate moisture and reduce weed pressure. Keep mulch away from the crowns and stems when piling it there would hold excessive moisture against plant tissue. The goal is to protect the soil, not smother the crop. Watch the transition from summer to fall rather than waiting for a date on the calendar to tell you what the plants already know. Cooler nights, less brutal afternoon heat, slower drying, and improved seedling establishment are signals. Your local extension planting calendar is another important signal because it reflects regional conditions better than a national list can. That is especially true across the South. A September planting recommendation for the Upper South may be too early or too late for a very warm Gulf Coast garden. Texas alone spans multiple planting regions. Florida has major north to south differences. Georgia gardeners can start many cool season crops in late summer and fall. But even there, weather changes from the mountains to the coastal plain. Use regional recommendations as your framework. Then let the actual weather refine your timing. There is also a simple way to keep this whole plan from becoming overwhelming. Think in waves instead of trying to plant everything on one weekend. Your first wave is the crops that need the most lead time and the strongest establishment. In many areas, that means getting suitable broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower transplants into their reserved positions when local guidance says the timing is right. Your second wave is the direct sown roots and sturdy greens that can use open soil as conditions moderate. Your third wave is the more heat-sensitive greens that become easier as the season cools. This wave approach gives you another advantage. You can learn from the first planting before committing all your seed. If the first radish row dries too quickly, improve moisture management before sowing the second. If the first lettuce container overheats on the western side of the patio, move the next container to a place with gentler afternoon conditions. If a bed drains slowly after a storm, correct that problem before putting a long-season crop into the same spot. A garden that teaches you something every week is more valuable than a perfect plan on paper. Keep records simple. You do not need a spreadsheet unless you enjoy using one. A note on your phone can record what you planted, roughly when you planted it, whether it was seed or transplant, and what happened during the first 2 weeks. Next fall, those few notes will be more useful than trying to remember whether spinach failed because the seed was old, the soil dried, or the weather was simply too warm. And do not overlook crop rotation when you clear summer space. If a section of the garden had serious disease problems, replacing the old crop with a close botanical relative can allow some problems to persist. Rotation is not a magic shield, especially in a tiny garden, but changing crop families where practical is one more tool for reducing repeated pressure. When space is too limited for perfect rotation, sanitation, healthy planting material, good airflow, and early observation become even more important. That brings us back to one of the easiest habits in the entire garden. Look closely. Once or twice a week, turn over a few leaves. Check whether new growth is clean. Look for chewing, clusters of small insects, unusual spots, or seedlings that disappear overnight. Check whether the soil beneath mulch is actually moist rather than assuming it is. Lift a container slightly and learn how its weight changes after watering. Small observations prevent small problems from becoming the reason you lose an entire planting. The best southern fall gardens are rarely the ones with the fanciest equipment. They are the ones where timing, moisture, spacing, and observation work together. A simple raised bed with 5 well-chosen crops can outperform a crowded bed with 15. 5 properly sized patio containers can be more useful than 10 tiny pots that dry out every afternoon. And 1 succession row planted 3 times can give you a steadier harvest than a huge sowing that matures all at once. So as you make your own September list, do not ask only, can I grow this? Ask, can I grow this well in the space and weather I have right now? That one question changes the whole plan. It turns a generic list into a garden strategy. And it is the difference between planting because the calendar told you to and planting because the conditions are actually ready. If you remember only one idea from this entire list, remember this. A productive southern fall garden is less about planting everything and more about putting the right crop in the right place at the right stage of September. Give longer crops the head start they need. Direct sow roots where they will stay. Use repeated harvest greens where you can reach them easily. Let fast crops occupy temporary gaps instead of stealing permanent space. Use containers for crops that truly justify the root volume. And when the heat refuses to leave, do not be afraid to wait on the crops that need cooler conditions. By doing that, the garden that looked exhausted at the beginning of September starts to change. Empty soil becomes rows of emerging roots and greens. Young broccoli and cabbage plants begin filling reserved spaces. Collards and kale develop leaves you can harvest without ending the plant. Radishes move through quick gaps. Bunching onions occupy edges. Containers that looked finished after summer begin producing again. The transformation does not happen in one magical week, and every crop will not mature at the same time. That is exactly the point. A good fall garden is a sequence. Fast crops start the harvest. Repeat harvest crops keep it going. Longer crops arrive later. Succession sowings replace what you remove. Instead of one giant harvest followed by empty beds, you build layers of production. So before you walk away from your summer garden, take another look at the space you already have. Decide which long-season crops deserve a head start. Identify the spots for direct sown roots. Reserve easy-to-reach areas for leafy greens, and leave room to sow again as conditions improve. You do not need all 15 crops to have a successful fall garden. You need the right combination for your climate, your kitchen, and your space. If this September plan helped you see your southern garden differently, use it as a starting point and compare it with your local extension planting calendar before you sow. Then choose the crops your household will actually eat. Start with the highest priorities and let the season build from there. A tired summer garden can still have a productive second act, and in much of the South, that second act begins with the decisions you make in September.